Hi, hello, vanakkam, and welcome to yet another episode on Little's Law YouTube channel. In our series of videos, we are seeing about the various logic controllers. We have covered various controllers like simple controller, transaction, random order, and various other controllers. And I believe those videos would have been very useful to you. So today, here we could see we have various switch controllers, but we have already seen about the switch controllers. But today, the topic is going to be about the module controller. So today we'll see what is a module controller and how to use module controller with this demo example, this script we have, which we have created for the switch controller. So before we see how does this module controller, let's execute a test with the switch controller we have. So we have a switch controller. We have two switch controllers inside a thread group, and we have other thread group as well. But for now, we have one thread group where we have two switch controllers, and we have defined the first switch, which is the second request. And here we have selected the second, which is the third request to execute. So let's see how does it execute. So we have one user and one loop count, and we are running the script now. So here we could see the first switch controller has executed the first request, which means the second, and then the third. So what is a module controller and how does it work? So before we see how does the module controller works or how to add a module controller, let's see what is a module controller. So the JMeter module controller allows switching between pieces of the test plan. And in JMeter, we have each piece is a controller that contains the child elements. Say, for example, we have a switch controller which contains these child elements, or we have a simple controller, we have multiple child elements, or we have a random controller which controls the elements in picking the request random. So we have various controllers that contains the child elements, and these controllers can either be placed in the thread group or in a workbench. So for other controllers, we have to place the request inside the particular controller. So for example, if we want to switch between these controllers, we have to keep these requests under the switch controller. But for the module controller, the case is totally different. We can either keep it on top of or as a parent of multiple requests, or in fact, we can even keep inside a test plan, or even we can keep it inside a thread group. So now we have a switch controller where we have multiple requests inside it. So what does this module controller do? So this module controller allows us to redirect the test execution to a given fragment or controller of the test. And that's why we use the module controller. So let's do one more thing. So let me switch or let me change this controller to a simple controller and let's see how does it work. So I have changed this to a simple controller. So let's see how does this simple controller works. So let me change this also as a simple controller. So now we have two simple controllers with one user and one loop count, and let's see what happens. So I'm running the test now, and here we could see all the requests have got processed. So let's now introduce the module controller. And before I introduce the module controller, this is me, Vasant Shanmugam. I request you all to subscribe to our channel. If you have not subscribed yet, please do like our channel, share the video with your friends, and comment your feedback and your questionnaires in the comment section. So now let's go to the module controller. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to add the module controller. So here we can see, let me just bring it on the top. So here we can see the module controller. I have added the module controller. So I'm not making any change now. I'm not touching anything. We have two simple controllers. We have executed them already and we saw the request has got executed. I'm again doing the same. I have not make any change other than adding the module controller and I did not make any changes here. So I'm running the test. I'm clearing this. I'm starting the test now. So this is the error we'll get. So this error tells us that the error occurred starting the thread group. And the error message is the module controller has no selected controller. So we have to be very careful because we have to select the target of the controller to execute. Otherwise, we will not be able to run the test. It won't execute any test until we choose the controller to execute. So here we have two controllers, and again there is a limitation that each module controller will select just only one controller. So even if if I'm selecting multiple controllers, I won't be able to do it. I'm clicking on shift button and I'm selecting multiple simple controllers. I won't be able to do it. So the limitation is the module controller will redirect the request to one particular controller. No matter what it can be a simple controller or a switch controller or a random controller or random order, but it will choose the controllers which it can select only once. So I'm choosing this simple controller here, the first simple controller, and let's now run the test and see what happens. So I'm running the test now. So here we could see the requests have got executed. So now let's make another change. So now I'm selecting the second simple controller and I'm running the test now. So let's see what happens. So here we could see the module controller has executed the simple controllers which we choose. So let's now see one more thing. So let's move this particular request outside of the controller and let's see whether this module controller can control this particular request. So now I'm moving to the module controller. So here we can see I have moved a request outside the module controller, but that particular request is not getting highlighted or it was not getting attended by the module controller. So let's do one thing. So we'll add a parent to the controller and let's now see what happens. So we'll add a once only controller. So we have once only controller and let's now go to the module controller and here we can see the once only controller here. So let's now try to make a change. So let's increase the loop count. So now the module controller is targeting to the once only controller. And let's run the test and see how does it work. Let's clear this request and let's run the request test. So here we can see it has executed all the requests which we see. So let's confirm which requests has got executed. So let's do one thing. Let's change these requests name to S1 so that we can identify which requests are getting executed, which is switch controller, first switch controller, second request, and this is first switch controller, first request. So the same way, let's change the name for all the requests so that we can easily understand what level of testing is happening here. So now we have all the simple controllers request, and let's now do the same for the second switch controller. So this is to understand how does this module controller works with various other controllers, whether they redirect or whether they choose everything or how does it work. So now we have two simple controllers, one once only controller, and let's first start with one loop count, which is one iteration. Let's see how does it work. So here we could see the module controller. It has executed all the requests which we chose here. So let's do one thing. We'll change the target to this simple controller and let's execute the test again. So here we can see the test has started with the second simple controller and then it moved back to the once only controller and then it went back to the first simple controller, this request, and then again it went back to the second request. So this is the order it has got executed. So let's now choose the first once only controller. So this is the target element. So in case if we want to understand, so if we have multiple scripts and if you are choosing a particular script and if you want to find the target element, you can easily find it through this. So now let's choose only the once only controller. So now we have got the once only controller and let's see how does this test work. So here we can see the once only controller. It has started with the first request twice and then it has executed the simple controller and then the second simple controller. So this is how the module controller works. So let's now do one more thing. So let's add two module controller. The first module controller will take care of the once only controller. The second module controller will target to the simple controller. And let's now see how does this test work. So now we have two module controllers. So the first module controller has executed the first request and then the second controller has started with the first simple controller. So the same way it has executed the values. So that's how the module controller works. So it targets to the element which it want to execute. So let's now do one more thing. So whether it controls only the module controller or whether it controls the thread group also. So I'm enabling the second thread group also. And let's now go to the module controller. So once I enable this, so automatically this thread group has got enabled. So I'm now moving to the second thread group's runtime controller. So I'm targeting it to the second runtime thread group runtime controller. So let's do one more thing. So I have two module controllers. So for the first module controller targets the second thread group's runtime controller, and again I'm targeting the same module controller under the another thread group and I'm targeting again to the same to the next runtime controller. So by using this module controller, we are targeting the runtime controller which is under the thread group of the second thread group. So let's see how does the test execute or what happens when we target multiple times twice the same thread group. Let's see what happens. So I'm running the test now. So I have executed the test. So even if we target both time, I mean twice with the module controller to the same request. So here we could see the runtime controller is executing the test with the thing time we have given. So that is how the module controller works. So even we can use the module controller from another thread group to a different thread group. So let's now do one more thing. So let's add this. Okay, so we are not able to add the thread controller or the logical controller outside the thread group. So for adding the module controller, we need a thread group and we can place it anywhere. So no matter what, we can use this module controller to control any thread group. So say for example, let me duplicate the thread group and let's see what happens. So here we could see the third thread group as well. So any number of thread group can be targeted by the module controller which we have added under the thread group or the module controller which we have in the JMeter. So that's how the module controller works. So let's now try one more thing, which is we have multiple module controllers and let's see in what order do they work. So we have runtime controller. So the first module controller will choose the first module controller will choose the second thread group or the second runtime controller the thread group. So let me do this way. So I'm choosing the module controller and let me define this way. So thread group 1 and thread group 2, and inside it this is runtime controller 1, this is runtime controller 2. Since there are two thread groups, so thread group 1 and under that we have runtime controller 1, and then we have thread group 2 and we have runtime controller 2, and we have two module controllers, so the module controller 1 and module controller 2. So say for example I have two module controllers and I have two runtime controller here. So I'm targeting the module controller 1 to the runtime controller 2, and then I'm selecting the module controller 2 and I'm selecting runtime controller 1. So let's now see in what order do they execute. Do they execute in this module controller 1 2 order, or do they execute in the thread group or whatever, or we'll understand how does this work, in what order. Is that a top down approach, or is it a bottom up approach, or is it a random approach? So let's start the test. So here we could see the module controller 1 has targeted the runtime controller 2. So that is the reason here we could see all the runtime controller second requests have started to execute. So this will run for 20 seconds. So we have 20 seconds crossed. So at the end of the test, we could see, let's now check it in the other thread groups as well. Okay, so I made a mistake. Let me just change it. So let me now rename it to request 1. Let's now execute the test. I think due to the name confusion, I have got confused. Okay. So what happens is the module controller 1 is targeting the first runtime controller. So it has started with the first time. So the first request has got executed by the module controller 1, which is the request 2, and then it has moved to the first request. So the same way the module controller executes the requests back to back, which means in what order the module controller is placed, so the same order the requests are getting executed. So to make it more clear, so what I'll do is like I will duplicate another module controller. So I'll name it as 3. So say for example, if we are running an application which contains multiple modules and you want to skip one particular module, you can easily avoid them by targeting only the required module. So let me duplicate the runtime controller here. I do not want to duplicate the thread group. So I have this runtime controller. So this I'm naming it as 3, and the request is again 3. So I have 3 controllers, and here I have 3 controllers. So for the second thread group, I'm selecting the third runtime controller. So now it will be the first module controller will execute the second runtime controller, and the second module controller will execute the first runtime controller, and the third module controller will execute the third runtime controller. So the order will go this way, and let's see how does the test execute. So here we could see the runtime controller request 1 and 2 are getting executed back to back. So let's now make a small change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this under a thread group. So let's add a thread group here. So let me remove this, or let me cut this for now. Let me duplicate another thread group. So I have a thread group 3, and let's see what kind of change has been made. So I have a thread group 3, and I will rename this controller to 3, because since we had this request under the previous thread group, we could not see this runtime controller is getting executed. So what I made is I have added 3 thread group with 3 runtime controllers, and let's see how does this work. And before that, let's switch it to the third controller. So now we have runtime controller 1 for the module 1, module controller 1 executes the runtime controller 2. The controller 2 runs runtime controller 1, and 3 will select the runtime controller 3. So let's now execute the final test and let's see how does it work. So when we choose, or when we keep them under different separate thread groups, so automatically all the runtime controller requests are getting executed. So let me make another change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this runtime controller into the previous thread group. Let me move this outside the thread group. Okay, so now we have 2 runtime controllers under this thread group 2, and let me change the target for this particular module controller, and let's see how does it execute. So initially we had the same setup, that is we had two runtime controller under thread group 2. It did not went fine like we have observed, and then I moved this runtime controller to thread group 3, and then it worked fine as we expected. So now I'm again moving back into thread group 2, and let's now see how does it work. So again we could see once I move this controller under the previous thread group. So if we have multiple controllers under the same thread group, and we even if we target, the module controller will not execute it properly. So let us try with one more example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this runtime controller as a child of this runtime controller. So now we have runtime controller 1 and runtime controller 2 and runtime controller 3, which is a parent of runtime controller is a child of runtime controller 2. And let's now see how does it work, because initially they were like 2 separate runtime controllers, and now we have one runtime controller as a child of the other runtime controller, and let's see how does the test work. So this will actually help us in setting up the test, or setting up this test scripts while we execute or while we do any testing. So let me run this test now and let's see how does it work. So now we could see that the test works fine because this runtime controller 3 is now part of the runtime controller 2, and that's how this test executes. So let's do one more thing. So for now we don't have any target for the module controller 3, and even in that case it will work. So we have to make sure that we need to at least select one, or we need to at least have one target for the a number of controllers. Even though we have 100 module controllers in our script, we need to choose at least one in our script. So let me do one thing. So let me remove all the module controllers. And there is one more thing. For the other controllers, we'll have option to change the controllers, but for module controller, we don't have that option, or we don't have any options like we have for other controllers. So for example, for the once only controller, we have this option of adding a sampler or adding a logic controller or adding an assertion, adding a timer or anything, and we can even add think time to the children, or even we can apply the naming policy, or we can change the controller or insert parent. But for the module controller, we don't have any of these options. And that is the difference between the module controller and the other controllers, since the purpose of the module controller is just to target the element or just to target the controller. So here I have the module controller 1, which has selected the second runtime controller, and I'm duplicating the other controllers. So now I have three module 3 controllers, and they have not selected any of the target elements, and only this module controller 1 has selected the runtime controller 2, and no other controllers have not selected anything. So let's now run the test and see whether we were able to execute. So here we can see clearly that even though we did not set up any target for other controllers, only this controller is executing. But let's do one more thing. We'll just remove this. So now we have no module controllers with no target elements, and let's now run the test and see how does it work. So here we could see the tests are getting executed. So again, just to end the video, so before that we'll see, so we have no controllers which are selected under this thread group, but when we execute the test, it will tell us that no controllers have been selected, but still it will execute the scripts in the other thread group. So this shows us that if we want to run the script, so what we have to do is like we have to select, or we have to keep all the controllers under the same thread group so that the test won't execute. So that is how this particular module controller works. So let's do one more thing. So now let me disable the other thread groups. So now we have only one thread group which we have enabled, where we have the module controller, but none of the elements have been selected. So let's now run and see what happens. So here we can see the test has not executed because no target elements were selected under the same thread group. But what we'll do is like now we'll enable the other thread group which is outside the module controller, and when we run the test, it will tell us the module controller is not selected, but the thread group which is outside the module controllers thread group, it will execute. So this is how. So this looks too complex, since placing the module controller inside one thread group and executing it. So this might look very, very confusing, but keep on practicing it, and one day we can easily do it. So this is how the module controller works. So the module controller is used to target a particular controller, and it will not target a particular request. And then we have to make sure that we have to select the controller during our test, otherwise it won't execute if it is inside the thread group. And if we don't target any controllers, then automatically the thread group or the request in the other thread groups will execute if there is no module controller in that particular thread group. So this is a mix of controller, and then this module controller don't have any other requests under it. It is just a module, it's just a controller that tells the JMeter to run a particular set of scripts. So that's how the module controller works. I think this video would have been very useful to you. We'll meet in another interesting video in the next session. Until then, it's bye bye from Vasan Shanmugam and Little's Law.